Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So till now we have completed all the OOPS concept. We have completed inheritance, we have completed encapsulation, then we moved on to polymorphism, and at the end we saw abstraction. And in abstraction we also saw how do we achieve them using abstract classes and interfaces. Alright, so we have discussed all the concepts of OOPS. We have discussed different features of interfaces and abstract classes, and we have also seen the difference between them. Correct. So this is how, this is all the concept that we have covered till now regarding the OOPS concepts. So now in our today's session, as I promised, that we will be learning something called as exception handling. Alright, so my first question is, what do you mean by exception? So exception, you might define like it is something that terminates, or like there is a moment in your program that causes some faultness, correct? That causes some fault to your program and your program terminates, or some abnormal conditions. This is something that you will define an exception, correct? So exception is, we can say that it is a kind of a condition in which we get our program terminated, or it is an abnormal condition, correct? So now what my another question is, what do you mean by errors then? So yes, the definition again lies the same, like it is also similar to the one that we have defined over here. But now what is the difference between them then? This is like sometimes you might get asked by the interviewer that what is the difference between exception and error. So the difference is, an error is something that is more fatal. Comparatively, it is more fatal than exception. So we can say that exceptions are less fatal comparatively, or comparative to the errors. Alright, now why I am telling that they are less fatal and they are more fatal? Correct, this is the another question that arises. So let's say we have a memory out of bound exception, memory out of bound exception or error, let's say, or let me give another example like stack overflow error. So this is an error. Now you know that what a stack is. In the memory there is a place where these stacks are there and where all the method calls and the variables are being stored. So if this space is full, is there any way, like is there anyhow you can handle the code? No, because it is full, which means full, correct? So these are something that is more fatal and you cannot handle errors. You cannot handle errors, correct? Can you handle errors? You will say yes, I will delete some memory, or I'll free up some space over here. But no, it is, you are doing some manual stuff. I am asking by code, can you handle this kind of any such scenarios? No, because you don't know that yeah, I will get the stack overflow error, but if the stack is overflown, then there is no way to making it correct. So this is something called as error. Errors cannot be handled. Just keep this thing in mind. Now let me give another example. This example might seems to be little bit confusing. So let me take another example. You have a syntax error. So let's say in Java you have declared a variable a like this, but you forgot to add the semicolon over here. So is there any way that you can run this code without having the semicolon over here? The answer is no, because it is a syntax error. We must follow a syntax to perform a code execution successfully. We must perform, or we must obey the syntax that is in general, like I have to tell the compiler, hey, this is a statement by saying this is an instruction by using this semicolon. If I do not use this, which means I have written a wrong code and it's a syntax error and I cannot handle it using a code. Am I right? Yes. So this is something called as error. Now let's move to our main topic, that is exception. So first we'll see what are exception. We have already known that what are exception. Exception, again, abnormal stuff that happens at the middle of your execution and it might terminate your program if you are not able to handle it. Correct? Yes. So exceptions are of two types. First we'll see two types of exception. So the first type is, let's say, checked. So the first type is checked exception and another type is unchecked exception. So these are the two type of exception. Like you might get an interview question that what are the different kinds of exception. So do not forget that there are two types of exception, checked and unchecked. So checked is also known as compile time exception or static, and unchecked are also known as the runtime and dynamic. You can use either one of this keyword. Okay, so these are the words that we know. So two types of exception, compile time exception and runtime exception, or to be precise, checked exception and unchecked exception. So now the question is, what are the difference between them, or what do I mean by checked or unchecked exception? So there are some exceptions that are caught by the compiler, and there are some exceptions that are not caught by the compiler but they are caught by JVM. And when does JVM comes into the action? JVM comes into the action at the runtime. So that's the reason why the exception that are caught by JVM is called as unchecked exception or dynamic or runtime exception. Alright, so do not get confused like this. We'll see an example of this, do not worry. Okay, so if an exception is caught at the compile time or by the compiler, it is known as checked exception. Otherwise, if it is not caught by the compiler and if it is caught at the runtime, that is by the JVM, then it is called as unchecked exception. Clear till now? All right, so now let's see some examples. So for now you don't know thread.slip, no worries, but when you write thread.slip, for I'll just for now I'll give you a quick glimpse that what do I mean by thread.slip. So it says that, hey, you have to stop execution for this many milliseconds. So let's say I pass 4000, it will stop, it will give a pause to our execution for 4000 milliseconds, that is 4 seconds. Okay, so now if I want to pause my execution for some time, I use this. All right, so now as soon as you write this line in Java, it will turn red, it will give us some error, and we'll see what error do we get. It will tell us to handle the errors. Let's say, let me move down, let me create a class over here, exception handling. All right, so now main method. Okay, let me create a normal method, public static void run or test. This is a normal method. So if I write thread dot sleep and if I give some millisecond timeout over here, or let me make it 5000. Okay, so now we get an error. It says that unhandled exception, just a second. Yes, so it says over here that unhandled exception type interrupted exception. So can you see, have I run the code? No, we haven't run the code yet, but then too we are getting the error at the, like we are getting the prompt that hey, you have to handle a error, which means this error is caught at the compile time because I haven't run this, correct? Which means this will be caught at the compile time itself even without running it. All right, so this is a kind of checked exception. So what example does it give? It says that unhandled exception type interrupted exception. So we can say that interrupted exception is an example of checked exception, correct? Because it has been checked at the compile time itself. We don't even have to run our code. So now, why do we need to handle this? See what happens. It says that this line, the line number 5 might, it is not like it will always throw, it might or it may throw an exception called as interrupted exception. Okay, so it is giving us the warning. Now it's up to us if we want to handle it or not. So we'll see how to handle it, do not worry about that. But for now, clear about this kind of exception? See, so whenever you see such red lines like this, when you are, means over here our code is right, but the error comes because of the checked exception, because the exception is checked at the compile time, and all the compile time stuff is done by the Eclipse without even running it, right? So that's the reason why we get the red line over here. All right, now, okay, so another example of this is when you do file input and output, all this stuff, the file handling, we get a IO exception. If you practice that, you will see this. Okay, so IO exception is again an example of checked exception. It is again caught at the compile time. Another example, SQL example. Okay, SQL exception, sorry. So SQL or SQL exception is again an example of checked exception. So this is again a question that can you give some examples of checked exception. So first exception that we saw, interrupted exception. Second we saw is SQL or SQL exception, IO exception, correct? And another one is, we can say that class not found exception. It is again an example of, so 3 are more than enough, but then too we can include class not found. Okay, so these are the example of checked exception, and we know that why they are known as checked. All right, so now let me comment this. Now, do you know any unchecked exception? Sorry, if you are answering it as no, then you are wrong. You actually know that there are some exceptions that you have already covered. There are some unchecked exceptions that you have already covered. So let's see what you have covered. Do you know array index out of bound exception? You do, right? You do know this exception, sorry, it is not an error. You know this exception, and when do we get this exception? If we try to point a index of an array, which is, if this index that I write over here, let's say 10, is beyond our array's length or array size, correct? So let's say array have 10 elements, we are pointing to the 10th index, which means it is not possible, because array for 10 elements the index will start from 0 to 9. So I cannot point to the 10th index, I can't even point to 12th, I can't even talk to -1 index. So at this moment of time we get array index out of bound exception. Now let me do this. So let me create an array over here, arr equals to and 1 comma 3 comma 4 comma something like this. Now arr Okay, system.out.println arr 0. Do we get any error? No, because you will say, hey, 0 is a valid index, you can point to that index, no worries. Yes. Now can I say 10 over here? Are there 11 elements present over here? No. But then too, do we get any error over here? No, we do not get any error over here. Correct? And now you will know that, there are only 8 elements present in this array. I cannot point to the 10th, that is 11th element, because there are no 11 elements present in the array. So you know that we'll get an exception. But yes, the compiler doesn't give us the prompt, doesn't give us the warning that hey, you can or you may encounter an error over here, because it is an example of unchecked, because it occurs at the runtime. So I'll get the exception when I run this. Okay, so if I try to run this, we get an array index out of bound exception. Or if you want more proof, then let me just change it to 10 and let me compile it, and then we'll run it. All right, so open with, show in terminal, sorry. Yes, so I am saying that Java C and C. Do we get any error? No, at the compile time we do not get any error. So this says that array index out of bound exception, array index out of bound exception is an example of unchecked exception. All right, so just make sure that you know this concept, because it is not encountered at the compile time. So now let me run this Java exception handling. So can you see we get an error, but it is not like the compiler didn't give us the head up, correct? It didn't give us the warning that hey, you might encounter an error if you try to point the 10th index, and that's the reason why, as I said, it is not caught by the compiler. That's the reason why we call it as unchecked exception. So another example of unchecked exception, null pointer exception, correct? When do we get the null pointer exception? When we point to an object that have not yet initialized, or it is null, correct? So if I say string s is equals to null, or just like this, and then if I say s dot length or s dot caret, any such operations, I am pointing to a null string, and strings are object, correct? So we'll get a null pointer exception. But yes, object, as soon as the word object comes into the action, just you should get clicked that hey, object means runtime, and runtime means even if the exception is caught, it will be runtime, which means unchecked exception. Arrays are also objects, and that's the reason why array index out of bound is an unchecked exception. This is the another reason. All right, so I believe you got a better understanding about what are checked and unchecked exception, and do you have any doubts, you can just ask me in the chat box. So now, as I said, see, in a very first slide I said that Java is robust. So what do I mean by robustness? Robust means durable, correct? Yes, so it is able to handle its exception easily or efficiently. It is durable, it can handle the abnormal situations. All right, though errors cannot be handled, like for example, if there is no internet, there is no code that will run your program that runs on server, because you need an internet connection, correct? All right, so yes, so now how do we handle exception in Java? Exceptions are the one that can be handled, as I said. So how do you handle this? So there are few ways. So first we'll say try catch. Okay, so what do I mean by try catch block? All right, so let me explain you this. Yes, so try catch are blocks like this. First let me say try. So what do you mean by try in your layman term? Let's say you have a do while loop. You are a compiler, you don't know nothing, correct? You come over here, you have been given an instruction, hey, do this, you will do this, and then you will check the condition. If the condition is true, you will again do this. The same way, you are the compiler, you don't have brain, correct? You will just see, hey, all right, I have to try this, I will try, correct? And it's up to the code whether it gives the exception or not. All right, so the try block is quite easy to understand. So try this few lines of code. So let me wrap a code inside the try. So let's say you know that this might give us an error. Yes. So you are saying that, hey, try this. Now can you see we get an error? Yes, we'll see the error what it says, but for now I have said that, hey, try this, because see why we are using try catch or try for exception handling, correct? Now I am introducing catch. All right, so now let's learn catch and then we'll execute some programs. So as you said, hey, try this few lines of code. Compiler will say, hey, all right, I want to try. I will move to the first instruction, I'll run. Okay, but what if the second line gives an exception? If you are not handling it, your program will terminate at that moment, correct? So let's say I don't have a try catch block like this or try block. Okay, and now I am saying that system.out.println hello. Will the hello get printed? No, because as soon as it encounters over here 10 is not a valid index, it will give us an error and the program will terminate. So it will run only if I am not having or I am not getting any exceptions, correct? But what if you know that, hey, this line might cause some exceptions? Okay, this line, the first line might cause some exception and you are the one who is supposed to handle it. And if the exception occur, do not terminate my program. Do not terminate my program. You need to proceed with the further steps. Correct. So you introduce the try block. So what you said to the compiler, first you try this, and if it throws an error, you catch it. You catch the exception. And what kind of exception? I will be helping you to understand what kind of exception this catch block will be handling. All right. Okay. So till now, any doubts? Okay. So I believe it's understandable to each and every one of you. So if any of the line throws an exception over here, the further line will get executed if and only if the catch block catches the exception or handles the exception, correct? So to be precise, what we can say that what we can conclude is the catch block is the one who is going to handle the exceptions. All right, so I have few lines of code. Now you know that there might occur any exception. So you say exception. Now this exception, see over here it is just kind of method parameters. Okay, but now this exception is an exception class that I am passing over here. Now your question will be, why you are passing an exception class over here? So exception class is the parent class. Okay, it's the parent class of each and every exception. So let's say you have a IO exception, you have a SQL exception, you have a array index out of bound exception, or let's say you have interrupted exception, all this kind of exception are subclass of exception. So it is obvious that if you create a catch block that handle this exception, which means you can handle any of such exceptions. Am I right? Correct. So I am saying that, hey, I am passing you the handler is this. So if the exception is of this type, you have to perform this task that is mentioned inside this curly braces and you proceed further. Correct? Okay. So now compiler is again blind and he don't even have brains. Correct. So try few lines of code, and if it works fine, then great. You have mentioned a catcher, the catcher is exception, so yes. So what you said is, hey, you try this, if it works fine, move with the other code. Otherwise, if it throws any error, go to the catch block, correct, and perform these lines of instruction that are mentioned over here, and again continue the action from here. Alright, so now this concludes that your further execution is not getting terminated. Correct. Now what kind of exception you are handling? You are handling a exception kind of exception. Yes, again it's confusing. So as I said, this is a kind of exception, and each and every exception are subclass of this exception class, which means if I want to categorize them, okay, if I want to categorize dog, cat, tiger, lion, giraffe, how or what word I will use to categorize them? You will say, hey, they all are animal. So the same way, all the exceptions are subclass of exception class. So if you can handle the animals, if you are able to get friendly with all the animals, which means you can be friendly with dog as well, cat as well, tiger, lion, giraffe as well. So this is how the try catch works. The same way if else works. If the condition is true, then perform this, else perform this. So the same way, try this, if it works fine, then no worries, skip the catch block, else go to the catch block. Correct. So the same way try catch works. Alright, so now let me move down over here and let me introduce the catch block over here, and this is just the parameter name. So I am saying this and system.out.println, oops, exception occurred. Correct. So now previously when I was not having any handler, when I was not handling this line, this hello won't get printed. Now let's see what happens. Can you see? It says that, hey, I have to try this line. Great, I have tried this. Does it throw any error? Yes. So then move to the catch block. Is the catch block have the handler that can catch this exception? This will throw what kind of exception? Array index out of bound exception. Array index out of bound exception. So is array index out of bound exception can be handled by exception? Definitely yes, because it is the parent. Great. Then move down to this catch block. Alright, then print this. This is what we got over here, and then move with the further execution the same way. Great. So now what if no exception is been thrown? Can you see? It prints this, it says okay, but it doesn't go to the catch block because no exception is thrown. Then why there is a need of to going to the catch block? So I believe that it's clear to everyone how try catch works. Now I'll explain you that you can have multiple multiple catch blocks with adjacent to the try. So what you are trying to do is, hey, you try this few lines of instruction, and if any error happens, or if any error exception get occurred, then I am having few handlers. Okay, I'll explain this, do not worry. Okay, so now what do I mean by this? So you say that this try catch block, sorry, this try block can throw array index out of bound exception, or it might throw IO exception, or it might throw SQL exception. So you are not directly using the exception superclass. You are just invoking, or you are just passing the handlers one by one. It's up to you how many handlers you pass. So over here I have passed 3 handlers. Previously I was passing only 1 handler. It's up to you how many catch block you introduce. Alright. So now what happens over here is, if this throws an exception, let's say it throws XYZ exception. So as soon as the exception is thrown, it will go to the catch block. It will check the handler. Can array index out of bound exception handle XYZ? No. Let's check the another catch block. Can IO handle the XYZ exception? No. Let's move down to next one. Can SQL handle the XYZ? No. Which means you are not able to handle the exception at all, which means you will eventually end up with terminating your program. So let me write, let's say over here I am having null pointer, I am handling null pointer exception. Okay, now let me run this. It will work fine because there are no exception occurred. But now as soon as I do this, can you see this line just get disappeared over here, because it doesn't get printed, it doesn't get executed, because what happens over here is this throws an exception called as array index out of bound exception. And can you tell me, is this exception can be handled by null pointer exception? No, not at all. Correct? This exception cannot handle this exception. Am I right? So which means you are not handling the exception, and that's the reason why the program crashes. Correct? So now let me introduce another catch block. I want to keep this null pointer as it is, because there might be a scenario where I can encounter this kind of exception. Correct? System.out.println what array index out of bound. Okay, or let it say encountered. Okay, and over here what we'll say is run null pointer. Yes, now if I run this, can you see we get hello printed, because now what happens, it says that you have to point to the 10th index. It is not possible. It will throw array index out of bound exception. Is it, and like is it can array index out of bound exception can be handled by null pointer? No. Let's move down to the next catch block. We have other catch block as well. Is this exception can be handled by this? Definitely yes. Then let's move down to the curly braces and see what instruction it says. Over here I am having only one instruction. You can have n number of instruction because there are no constraints as such. Okay, so it says that encounter array index out of bound exception, but now you have already noticed that exception is been handled. So now you can proceed further with your further execution, so it won't terminate the other lines of code. All right, so do you understand till now? Okay, so now which of them, like which is the superclass of both of them? Which is the superclass of both of them? The exception class, correct? Am I right? So let's say I have a try block, few lines again, a catch block, again a catch block. Okay, now yes, I have a exception. I am handling the exception kind of exception, and as you know, this is the superclass of all, which means any exception, any, just mark this word, any exception can be handled by this exception. Correct? I am having array index out of bound exception and I am having IO exception. All right. So what happens over here? If this throws any error, which catch block will be handling it? Let's say this throws array index out of bound exception. It will move to the first catch block. Can this first catch block handle this kind of exception? Yes. If it throws IO, can it? Yes. If it throw SQL, can it handle? Yes. If it throw XYZ exception, then too it can handle. Correct? Because as I said, exception is the parent class of any exception, of all the exceptions. So now you got an idea that these two catch block are of no sense. Correct? So if you try to have multiple catch block like this, and if you want to include the exception class as a handler, so always include it in the end, because if you include it at the first, which means no other catch block will be, means other catch block will be of no use, because each and every exception will be handled by the first catch block, and then other two are of no use and will get an error that you cannot, means they are unreachable code, because the code won't reach to that kind of catch block, because all the exceptions will be handled by the first catch block if you have this exception over here. So try to make this habit, like if you are having the exception class and you are using multiple catch block, always put this class at the end. So let's give it a try. So over here, let me introduce a catch block, and if I say exception, just a second, yes, so if I say system.out.println, and inside the exception catch block, do you see we do not get any error because it is a valid example. See, if it throws an IO exception, okay, so can it be handled by this catch block? No. Can it be handled by this catch block? No. Then can it be handled by this catch block? Yes. So it will end up going over here. So let me just remove this array index out of bound. Okay, and now let me run the code. Can you see what happens? What happens over here is it throws array index out of bound exception. Correct? Can it be handled by null pointer? No way. Can it be handled by exception? Yes. So we are placing it over here. So it says that inside the exception catch block, and then it prints, or I can say that it continues the execution. Am I right? Now let's say I'm introducing the another catch block after this class. Now can you see we get an error, and the error says that unreachable catch block, because as I said, anything other than, like anything next to exception cannot be reached. Correct? Other catch block below the exception catch block cannot be reached, because if any encounter, if any exception like IO or array index like this happens or takes place, and if this catch block cannot handle it, it will move to this catch block, and this catch block can handle any kind of exception. So there is no way of declaring this catch block, or there is no sense of declaring this, because it is unreachable. So always make a habit that if you are having the catch block which handles with the help of Yes. So if a catch block handles the exception with the help of exception class, try to place it at the end. All right. So is it clear to everyone till now? So can I have multiple catch block? Can I have multiple catch block after this? How many catch block can I have after a try? You can have n number of catch block. Okay. Can you have try and catch? Let me give it a try. Does it works? No, we get an error. So just keep one thing in mind, that you cannot have multiple try block adjacently or one below the other. The reason you already know. With if you need a else statement, let it be else if, but it is a else statement, correct? So the same way, if you are trying this, if you fail, then you have to do something. You have to tell the compiler, because compiler is again blind, it doesn't know what is happening. Try, he will try, and then he will ask, what if I fail? I failed, now what should I do? Okay, so you are catching the exception. Like if the exception takes place over here, and you cannot mention again try, because who will handle this exception then? All right, great. So now I'll introduce something called as finally block. Okay, so what do I mean by finally? So you are saying that try this lines of code and at the end or finally do this task. Okay, now what happens? This lines of code, if it works fine, then great, then it will move to finally and it will perform this task. But if an exception occurs and you are having no handlers, no catch blocks, correct? We don't have any catch blocks. Then too, it will end up the execution, like it will end the execution only after completing this lines of instruction. So finally is a kind of block which will run. So let me write it. Finally will run irrespective of whether an exception takes place or not. Okay, so what do I mean by this? So if an exception takes place, then to finally will work. If an exception doesn't take place, then to finally will work. Okay, so this is a kind of mandatory block. It is irrespective whether the exception is occurred or not. It is irrespective, it will always get executed. So now your question will be, why do I need? You know the need of try catch, because yes, I want the execution to not get terminated, so I am trying and catching the exception. Then why do I need a finally? So there might be scenarios. Let's say you are trying to get a connection with your database. Okay, connecting DB, executing first query, okay, and then executing second query with the database. Okay, so yes, so what happens over here? You got the connection with the DB. Okay, you executed the first statement or first query with the DB, but now at the second query, your program or you encounter an exception. Okay, you encounter an exception. So your DB's connection is still there, it is still present, and it is always a best practice to terminate, to close the connection. So in the finally block, what you will write is close connection with the database, correct? Now even if the exception occurs, it is irrespective whether the catch block handles it or not. Then too, I want to close the connection with my database, and this is a mandatory step whether the exception occurs or not. So in the finally, you will always have something that is mandatory, that is something very crucial. Okay, there are sessions, you need to close these sessions, otherwise you will have the open window, and that might be a headache for the organization, because these are the loopholes, correct? And we are not supposed to leave these loopholes, correct? All right, now before moving to finally, I'll just explain you something. System.out.println, hi there. Okay, let me run this. Can you see hi there is not printed? What happens over here? Try this. I am trying this. I get an exception. I move down to this line. See, this line have not yet touched, correct? It has been directly redirected over here, checking this whether this exception can handle it, no. Whether this can handle it, yes. So I am printing this and I am moving further with my execution, because you know this, the try catch is a block, it is not a loop, so it won't go and repeat the task over here. So this line is untouched, so this won't get executed because the exception occurs at this moment, so it will just handle it and proceed with the other lines of code, correct? All right, so just keep this thing in mind. And what if the exception doesn't occur? If the exception doesn't occur, then what will happen? This executed, this instruction will again get executed because there is no exceptions. I'll do it the way I was supposed to do, and then there is no need of catch block, like moving down to the catch block, because no exceptions are been encountered. Then it prints hello. So this is how the execution works. Okay, so now previously you would have told me that all right, try connect with the database, first query, second query, or you will try to close the connection. Okay, but now what if you encounter the exception over here? You cannot close, it won't go to this line, correct? So it is mandatory to close your connection in the finally. There is no need to write it over here, because finally will, irrespective whether the exception occurs or not, it will, irrespective of that, it will always get run, correct? So now you can have the handlers. Okay, you know the job of handlers, the catch block, correct? So even if the exception is handled or not handled, that doesn't matter, finally will always get executed. So let me just introduce the finally block. System.out.println, inside finally. So can you see over here, I do not get any exception, correct? I do not get any exception. So it says this, the first index is 3, then hi there, then it says inside finally, and then it prints hello. So no exception occurred at this moment. Let me cause the exception to get occurred. We get an exception, this catch block handles the exception, it prints array index out of bound, and then it again moves to the finally. So it is irrespective whether the exception is occurred or not occurred, handled or not handled, that doesn't bother the finally block, it will always get executed. Just keep this thing in mind. So let me say I do not have any catch block. As I said, no worries, the finally will first get executed and then only the program will terminate, correct? I am getting the error over here, but yes, it will wait for the finally block to get executed. So it says that inside finally, and then it gets terminated. So this is how the execution works with the finally block. You cannot have multiple finally attached, okay, like this. Okay, so you cannot have something like this. You can have one finally associated with one try block. So I believe you got a pretty good understanding of how we use try, how we use catch, what is the use of finally, and we have associated all three together as well in this example, correct? So I believe you have got a better understanding of this kind of scenarios. Okay, now let me introduce with a throw. Okay, throw. So I'll ask you, what do you mean by throw in your normal English? What do you mean by throw? Throw something, correct? Throw a piece of paper means you are throwing something. So the same way, if you want your program to throw an error or throw an exception, you will say throw exception. As I said, they are classes, correct? All of them are classes. So array index out of bound. So you need to create an object. So you are using the new keyword. So hey, throw array index out of bound exception. So which means you are deliberately throwing an exception, and the exception is array index out of bound exception. This is all about throw. So let me use this, and there is nothing much more than this. All right. So do not get confused or worried about this stuff. So throw, you are saying, hey, throw this exception. And if that's it. Now this will throw an exception called as array index out of bound exception. Now you know that at this line will throw an exception, and you are deliberately doing this, then there is no sense of having other lines below that, correct? Because they are unreachable line. So let me comment this out. Yes. So now this try block throws an exception, and you are deliberately throwing this exception. And what kind of exception it is? It is an array index out of bound exception. So it will move, it will try this, it will throw an error, sorry, exception. No, this cannot handle it. Yes, this can handle it. It will print encountered array index out of bound, and then it will print inside finally, and then it will print hello. And this is what we discussed. So this is all about throw, correct? There is nothing much more in throw. Okay, now the other word or other terminology that you will see is throws. See, this is again an important interview question, that what is the difference between throw and throws. Okay, so what is the difference between throw and throws? So now you know throw, which means you are deliberately throwing an exception, correct? Now what do I mean by throws? So I will again ask you, what do you mean by throws? What does the word throws in normal English means? So if I say that he throws a piece of paper, which means someone is throwing a piece of paper. But not, see, if I say he throws something, which means you are not catching that something. Like let's say he throws a ball. Okay, you are not catching the ball. You are just saying that hey, he throws a ball. Correct? You are not doing anything with the ball. Correct? So this is the same way. Throws keyword, just say, it will just give you the warning kind of stuff. Okay, it will say that hey, this method throws an exception, and the exception is array index out of bound, let's say. Okay, so this method throws an exception. It is not catching the exception, as I said. Okay, so now let me say over here, you know try catch, correct? Now let me say this test block throws an exception called as, it throws an exception, and exception is array index out of bound exception. But now, okay, let me declare the array again. One comma 2 comma 3 comma 4 comma 5. I'll point to array at 10 again, and now then I'll write system.out.println hi there. You know this will throw an exception, but now as I said, throws won't handle the exception, so you know that the program will terminate it, because it is just giving up the head up, correct? Hey, this is just giving us the warning, correct? So it will say hey, just be sure that the test method gives this exception. It is not handling any kind of exception, it is just giving us the detail, the metadata about that particular method. So yes, the throws won't handle any exception. It is declared or it is used at the method signature, correct? This is our method signature, public static void test, and over here I am using the throws keyword, throws with the s. Okay, so throws the kind of exception. Okay, I believe that it's much clear to all of you. So throw will deliberately throw an exception. Throws will give you the warning that hey, or give you the meta information, the metadata about a method. Okay, not the warning. I am just explaining it in my way, but actually it will give you the information about the test that it might throw an exception called as array index out of bound. It is not like it will always throw, because it's up to your code, but you have just given the warning that it might throw. Correct? Yes. So throws, you know. Now try, you know. Catch, and finally, you know, multiple catch block are possible. No multiple try adjacently and no multiple finally adjacently. Correct? So clear to all of you till now. So can you have try without catch? We have saw that, right? We can have try with finally. So yes, you cannot have only try block. Okay, you must have a catch block associated with it, or catch and finally, or you should have at least finally block associated with it. Okay, and no catch can, like, only catch is not possible because there is nothing to catch. Correct? You have to first try something, then only you will get an exception. Correct? So you cannot have catch blocks like this. Okay, so I believe it's clear to all of you till now. And again, can you have finally directly? No. Correct? Because again, this all stuff are associated with the try block. So I believe it's clear to all of you what do I mean by try, catch, finally, throw, and throws. So all these terminologies are the terminologies that are used in exception handling in Java, and there is nothing else other than this. Yes, you can create your custom exception, and I'll make a new video, like I'll make a separate video for that, for creating your own exceptions. All right. Yes, and there is something else as well that I would like to tell you about this. Like, what if you want to print the stack trace? Correct? So let's say you have this line over here and it gives you an array index out of bound exception. Catch, you are using this, you can use any class. Correct? Now there is a method called as print stack trace in the exceptions class, like this, and all the exception are child class of exception, and exception class implements the extends the throwable class. Yes, so now there is a method called as if I say print stack trace, it is a method of throwable class. So what happens over here is, see, it goes inside the catch block, correct, but it prints the stack trace. Okay, it is not terminating my program. If I am having anything over here, hello, yes, it won't terminate my program. Correct? The hello comes over here, but the stack trace is printed because I am calling the print stack trace method. So just keep this thing in mind, that if you want to get the exact stack trace, like what happens at what line and all that happens, then you can call this particular method. All right. So okay, so do you have any doubts till now? You want me to create a video about Eclipse? All right, if possible, I'll create one video regarding like how to use Eclipse, what are the shortcuts do we get. Okay, do not worry about that. So I believe that's all for exception handling, and try and practice the concepts. And I don't think there are much more concepts, like you are pretty much confident if you can do this much of stuff that I have explained you, then you will be pretty much confident to crack any interviews or any interview question regarding the exception handling. Yeah, so I'll create a separate video after the series for creating your custom exception, because there is no sense of explaining it now because it makes the concept confusing. All right, okay, so I'll end the session for today. Is multiple catch block like multiple else if block? Yes, the same way, definitely. Like we have related the try with if, correct? So if this condition satisfied, perform the task over here. Okay, so if there is no exception, no worry to go to the catch block. As I said, if block is executed, you won't go to the else block, correct? But if you have multiple catch blocks, so then there are multiple handlers, correct? So like the same way, and at the end you have the finally, correct? So what happens if this throws an exception? It will check whether this catch block can handle it or not. If it not, it will move down to the next one, whether it can handle. If it can, then it will move to the block inside this and it will execute the instruction over here. All right, so thank you everyone for joining today's session. We'll meet in our next session and we'll see further concepts. So till then, practice, and if you face any difficulties, please let me know. I'll definitely help you out.